Morning, students, staff, faculty. Good to be with you in chapel this morning. And just reminded of last week Tuesday, as I was sitting in the house and I heard the carolers driving up my driveway and are walking up the driveway. About 20 of you from the dorms, a bunch of the guys' care groups came over to our place. And and singing "I Wish You a Merry Isolation," and kind of enjoyed that. And I want to have a devotional this morning, actually, about another group of people that were in isolation. I want to take it out of Isaiah 43, but before you flip that up, Professor Patrick, maybe I'll just say a few words. I went and on Saturday morning, I got a text from Lindsay, last year's grad, and she just said, "I've got time on my hands now because her schooling is shut down at Red River," and she said, what could I study? I want to do an exegetical. And I said, well, why don't you do Isaiah 43, 1-7? And so that was the challenge I threw at her, and I thought I better, when Professor Patrick asked me to do a devotional for this morning, I thought, well, maybe it's time for me to do an exegetical on Isaiah 43. Any of you that are students with either Professor Arlene or myself have had the joy of using highlighters and working through texts, and so I've done a little bit of that on this passage as well. I think Professor Patrick is going to throw that up on the screen. I believe he's able to do that. And is that working? Kurt, are you seeing the passage up on the screen, or Patrick, or do I need to share it?
You need to share it. Yeah.
This is all me here. This is such a bad person I am. But I think now it's going to potentially be there for all y'all. Is that right? Professor Patrick's going to share that with you, I think. All right. Okay, good. Yeah, so Isaiah, context for Isaiah 43, then we have the people of Israel, Judah, off in exile in Babylon. During the first 40 chapters of the book, we ended up with warnings that COVID is coming. While it was Babylon. Exile is, and once you get to chapter 40 in Isaiah, the tone sort of shifts as they end up in Babylon, in exile, in isolation, quarantine, as they've been removed from the land. And that tone shifts in Isaiah chapter 40. It says, Isaiah 40 begins with comfort. Comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem. So the tone shifts in Isaiah chapter 40. And we get to chapter 43, and here we have a message now to the people that I think is really relevant for us in our time. God starts off by saying to the exiles, but now, thus says Yahweh, your creator, O Jacob, and he who formed you, O Israel. And so he has this message for them, and before he even gives them the message, he reminds them of a few fairly important things. One is that God's your creator. He is the one that started this all. He is the one that created us all. He is the one that formed us all. That's taken us right back to Genesis chapter 1 and 2. God, our creator, the one that formed us in his image. And so the message comes to them that this God who formed you has a message for you. For those of us that are in wisdom literature right now, and we've been working with Ecclesiastes, when the life is meaningless for the first 11 chapters of Ecclesiastes, he finally gets to chapter 12, and in chapter 12, verse 1, then Koheleth writes, and he says, remember your creator in the days of your youth. And so there's the reminder for us that we live in relationship to a creator. We are not the creator, we are the created ones, and we are in relationship with our creator, the one that formed us. And so in verse 1, it says, then to these people, from Yahweh, your creator, the one that formed you, and he says, do not fear. Do not fear. That phrase, do not fear, those words in that exact phrase is seen 58 times in the Bible. That phrase 58 times. Do not fear. And 10 of those are in Isaiah. Not surprisingly, because here you have a people that are in exile, they're in Babylon, and there would have been a lot for them to fear. Will we ever get to go back? When will things ever return to normal? When are we gonna be able to go back to the land again? When will we get to go back to college again and be together as a community? And so of the 10 times in Isaiah, 1 time was before chapter 40, and that was back in chapter 10 when they were supposed to not fear the Assyrians, because that was what was happening to their sister northern Israel. They were being wiped out by the Assyrians. He says, don't worry about the Assyrians. Assyrians will not be your problem. But now in these last, so the remaining 9 times are all while they're in Babylon. Do not fear, because I have redeemed you. I have redeemed you. God has done this in the past for Israel. Remember Jacob the deceiver. When God meets Jacob the deceiver, God changes his name. He redeems him. And instead of being known as Jacob the deceiver, he is known from then on as Israel. And Israel means God's perseverance or his rule. And so you've been redeemed. You're no longer the deceiver. You are the one that has been redeemed. We are those that God has redeemed. The one that created, the one that formed us. And then he says, I have called you by name. You are mine. It's nice to have people remember our names. And when you have somebody's name and you call them by name, it's because you have a relationship. And God recognizes that we are Israel. We are his people, and he calls us by name. And with the native people up north, they say that with the native people, you know that you belong when they give you a nickname. And so at my dad's funeral, it was neat as the people from Nelson House came to sing. And my dad's nickname, I've told a lot of you that his nickname was I am Ihatan, which means let's pray. And so at dad's funeral, when they were singing in Cree, and then they were going to sing Kidape Kisikao, there's coming a day. Then the group up there asked me and says, I'm going to ask I am Ihatan Jr. to come and pray with us. It's neat to have a name. It's neat to have a Cree name. And then he goes on in verse 2, and he says, when you pass through the waters, I'll be with you. Not if, but when. And he knew that the waters were going to come. And he's referring back now, I believe, in history to when God delivered them the first time. When he called them by name, he called them his people, and then he delivered them from Egypt. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. And through the rivers, they will not overflow you. When you walk through the fire, you won't be scorched, nor will the flame burn you. These things were going to happen. And God doesn't say that the waters, the rivers, and the fire won't happen. He says, when they happen, I will be with you. And they are going to be reminded, as they're in Babylon now, they will be reminded of God's faithfulness in the wilderness and the way that he delivered them, 600,000 of them leaving Egypt. And although many of them, that generation dies, 600,000 enter the land. God was faithful, and he walked with them. And that's what being with you looked like for the people as they're listening to this in Babylon. It goes on to verse 3, and it says, for I am Yahweh, your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I am Yahweh, your God. That will have reminded them, I think, of the Shema, the Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5. I am Yahweh Eloheka. I am Yahweh, your God, and love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with everything that you have. And so he says, I am Yahweh. I am your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. And then he goes on and he develops what he earlier said when he says, I have redeemed you. Now he says, I've given Egypt as your ransom, Cush and Seba in your place. And so here this idea of God's redemption is expanded, and that God is paying the ransom to free his people. He will pay the amount that it's going to take for them to get out of the land. God is the deliverer, and he pays the ransom. He goes then he switches over to the present tense now in verse 4. Since you are precious in my sight, since you are honored, and I love you. I'm not sure where your emotions have been taking you over the last week or so. But, these from here, I underline them because they're powerful words. You're honored, and I love you. And then he goes back to this ransom idea. I gave other men in your place and other peoples in exchange for your life. He did that with them when they left Egypt. He freed them from Egypt, and now he's going to give other people in their place in exchange for their life. For me, that's just pointing straight to the New Testament and Christ, as we have another one that is going to be given up as redemption for us. And Christ comes to redeem us and to ransom us. And then those reassuring words in verse 5, do not fear. There's the word again, for I am with you. I will bring your offsprings, and here they're going to gather the scattered people in exile from the east and gather you from the west, and to say to the north, give them up, and to the south, do not hold them back. bring my sons from afar and my daughters from the ends of the earth. And I love those words again, familial terms. Bring my sons from afar and my daughters from the ends of the earth. Here's God's his sons, his daughters, and he has this promise for his people. God's redemption isn't only going to be for Israel, but it's going to be, in verse 7 it says, for everyone that is called by his name. Everyone who's called by his name. And so we can claim these promises given to a people in exile in Babylon. We can claim these promises for ourselves. And then the reminder again, which ties right back to the beginning of the passage. Chapter 1, in verse 1, ends off in verse 7. I've created for my glory, whom I have formed, even who I have made. And so we see in this passage, God's faithfulness is linked in the past to his deliverance in Egypt. And now for us, it's past also what he did at bringing them back from exile. And we can claim that today. We are now exiled off campus. And yet God is with us. We're precious in his sight. You are honored, and God says, I love you. And so we're separated by miles. We share the same God. We share the same family. And we can claim these promises that God has given to us, that he will be with us. So do not fear. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you for watching this chapel service. If you'd like to see a few others, you can click the subscribe button or the link to the other videos.